started?
Yeah, I think we're ready to get started. So
awesome. So I'll kind of kick things off here, and then I'll pass it over to you.
Okay.
First off, thanks everyone for joining, taking some time out of your Monday for this today. We're going to be doing a topic that's a little different than the ones we've done before. A lot of our previous webinars that we do every 2 weeks have been around data engineering with Airflow, doing specific things with an Airflow. This one's a little more infrastructure related. Thing we see that our users ask us questions about a lot. And, I think it'd be good to kind of talk about how companies that are on AWS, how Airflow kind of your multi-account strategy. Just a few logistics items before we dive in. Number one, please feel free to drop any questions in the chat or the QA section. We'll either get to them during the presentation or right after. Number two, this will be, and kind of all the materials that we're going to go through will be kind of disseminated to you in the next couple of days after the webinar. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for logistics there. That said, Tony, I'll pass it off to you.
All right, thanks, Raj. Yeah, and Raj, just real quick, is my screen showing the appropriate slide at this point?
You're great. Yeah, all you're missing is your intro.
All right, thank you. All right, so again, today we're going to talk about using Airflow in a multi AWS account environment. That can mean a lot of things to a lot of different folks. It could mean, running multiple Airflows in different accounts and how you might do that. In this particular case, we're going to talk about having a single Airflow be able to orchestrate things that live in multiple accounts. To help initiate the conversation, I'm going to be reviewing a particular DAG during this webinar today. This DAG, as you can see here, just ran earlier this morning, and it's fairly simple and one you might see a lot in a kind of typical AWS environment. It creates an EMR job, so it creates the cluster, it runs a Spark job. It then implements a watcher that essentially waits for the job to finish. As soon as that job is finished, there's going to be some S3 data maneuvering. It's going to take some of that data that was touched by EMR and it's going to move it from one place to another. And at the end, we're going to run a query on it with Athena. So that's going to be essentially what the DAG looks like. So what that looks like, I'm actually going to show that in a slide here. So here's that same DAG essentially written on a slide. Now, at this point, this is really common, and I don't think there's really many advanced procedures to do to get something like this accomplished. But we're going to put a little wrinkle into the mix here. One is we're going to have EMR live in a particular AWS account. And then we're going to have Athena be running on another AWS account, completely separate from where EMR is. And they're both going to be talking to S3 buckets that are separate and exist in those particular accounts. And then lastly, we're going to have Astronomer and Airflow running in a third AWS account. This is a pattern that we see a lot where Airflow tends to fit in kind of like a shared services type account where the Airflow can touch a lot of different things potentially in a lot of different accounts. So this is essentially the DAG that you just saw is doing exactly this. And here's a little more description of how that looks. So as you can see, we have Airflow running in what we call the shared service. In this particular demo, Astronomer is running in EKS in this third account. Now, before we get into too much of the details of how we set this up, I think it's a good question to ask is, why? Why would we want to do this, right? It's plenty easy enough just to have everything running in a single AWS account. With that said, we actually have a lot of customers who are, running in this type of environment today. And the most common reasons we see are essentially these. The first one is around data lifecycle management. We see a lot of companies that will divvy up their AWS accounts to map to different stages in that lifecycle management. Perhaps when data comes in, it's forced to put into a particular raw zone, for example, or a collection zone, where that hasn't been scanned yet, it hasn't been combed, we don't necessarily know if there's sensitive data or not. And then eventually it'll work its way up the promotion process from like a process to an analytical, and eventually to a stage where it can be shared with other folks. Another pattern we see is like a CI/CD pipeline, right? Perhaps the AWS accounts map to different stages like build, test, stage, release. It's another one that we see a lot. And maybe the most common one we see is chargeback in terms of different users have different roles in this pipeline, but whatever they're doing, they need to be held accountable for cost, right? And so they like the easiest way to do that in AWS is just to give them their own account, let them go wild, and their job is to pay the bill at the end of the month, right? And then last one is a security thing, right? Different zones around who's able to access what. Lots of times you'll have fully private AWS accounts, for example, that can't even be reached from the outside world in any way. And then those will eventually make their way to other AWS accounts through transit VPCs and so on and so forth. But all of these reasons are reasons why customers will end up needing to maybe have a pipeline that could go across these different things. So then the question is, all right, that's the why. So how are we going to go about doing this? This is the basic gist, right? We showed this before with the different accounts in different areas. In this particular case, we're actually going to be using AWS cross-account roles. And this means that we don't even really need to have secret keys and passwords and stuff like that being passed around, right? Everything that I'm going to show today is actually done without a secret access key combo. Depending on your environment, your own environment security policies, you may or may not have a preference for one or the other. A common pattern that we see, though, is the use of cross-account roles, and that's what we're going to be doing in this demo.
Hey, Tony, quick question. If I'm somebody who's setting up a shared service, why would I want to use cross-account roles versus the key secret key? Like, what would be some of the motivations around that?
Yeah. So the main reason is that secret keys in and of themselves have the permission to do whatever, and you don't necessarily have control of where they end up, right? And so a lot of organizations will want to have really strict control over where a secret key is. And even the ones that do use them will put them in things like AWS Secret Manager or Vault, for example, and they'll be really protected. And the reason that is that if anyone ends up with that secret key, they essentially have the permission to do whatever that key has, right? You'll see a lot of breaches happen because people will leave their secret keys in things like repositories on GitHub. And there's enough scanners out there that most people suggest that if you just post a secret key on GitHub, it's going to be grabbed within minutes of it showing up there, right? There's people scanning for those type of things all the time. So in general, folks are looking for other ways. And so the other way you can do this is, and I'll demonstrate this today as how you set this up, but you can actually go to these AWS accounts, AWS account 1 and account 2, and you can create a specific role in those accounts that says, okay, this role is going to be dedicated to things being done by this third account at the bottom, right? And this is called the AWS cross-account role. And it's really, if you're going to be doing lots of inter-account communication, it's really a best practice as a way to set this up, because the only way then that someone would be able to leverage that role is if they were in that AWS account 3, they already had the role assigned and they had those permissions, right? Before jumping into the AWS setup, I'm also going to touch a little bit on the DAG itself, right? So if I go to another tab here. So here's the DAG that I referenced. I am going to briefly touch on the code itself. So here is the DAG we wrote, and in it, you see it starts here, and it's going to have those 4 tasks that you saw on the screen. One of the nice things about Airflow is the ability to set up these connections, and then you can reference them in your DAGs. And so at the top, I've referenced 3 accounts, the 3 that I mentioned here: AWS account 1, AWS account 2, AWS account 3. AWS account 1 is where EMR is going to be run. AWS account 2 is where Athena is going to run its query. And AWS account 3 is going to be where Airflow is running. And I'll talk about why we need that here in a sec. But if we scroll down to our task, here is the EMR job. Notice that when you're using Airflow connectors and operators, one of the nice things is that they have built-in ways to do this. And so essentially, all I need to do is specify my AWS connection ID in this 1 line of code here, and then it's going to run as account 1, this particular task, right? When we go down to the watch job, it's going to be the same one. But then as we move our way down to the Athena one, you're going to see that this references AWS account 2. So this is how you specify the accounts. And I'm also going to show where these are pulling from in these descriptions. You will notice that the copy of data from one S3 bucket to another, I'm actually running this as the account 3 here, but there's lots of different ways that you can make this copy happen, which I'll review in the slides later. Okay, let's get back to the slides. Okay, so let's go through the different steps to set up these cross-account roles. So the first thing you need to do is go to the accounts that are going to be running your task and create the cross-account role. So in this case, I went to both AWS account 1, where EMR was running, and AWS account 2, where Athena was running, and I went in and created a new role just for this purpose, right? You can see this is what the UI looks like in AWS to do this. You go in and you say, I'm going to create a new role. It's going to be belonging to another AWS account. And then you actually enter the account ID in this field here, right? The nice part is that you then get to attach the policy to this role. And Raj, you asked earlier about like other reasons why people like this type of setup, is that these policies can be then scoped very specifically to the things you want to do. And so the bare minimal policy for this particular job would have been to have, it can do EMR and it can talk to S3 and that's it, right? It's not going to be able to do anything else. And the same idea for the Athena one. You will need to make note of what the role ARN that gets created, because we're going to use that in the next step. So the next thing we need to do is go back to our Airflow account. And here we need to let it know that it needs the ability to assume other roles. Because even though the other accounts have granted this particular account's permission to use it, we kind of both have to turn our keys, so to speak. And so on this account, we need to say, I have the ability to assume another role. And in this case, I went in to the IAM role that Airflow is running as. Now, what role that is going to be in the next slide in terms of how to figure that out. But essentially, we're going to go in, look at the IAM role that Airflow is running as, and we're going to say it has the ability to assume role on these two IAM roles. Now, notice that this is a globally unique identifier here. This is how an AWS account can know about an IAM role that's in any other account basically on the planet. And so here I'm saying my role has the ability to assume these two roles. Now, how do we find this role, right? So which IAM role Airflow is running as is going to be determined by a few things. A very vanilla Airflow installation, for example, that I just installed on top of an EC2 cluster, most likely is just going to be running on the role that's assigned to that EC2 node, right? Anything that runs within that Airflow is all going to have that role, and that's just the one that it's going to inherit. Another common pattern, especially people using Astronomer running on top of EKS, the default role is still going to be the role that's on those EC2 nodes, right? One thing to note, though, is that in the Airflow connection screen, you can override this. You can provide, if you want, an access key to that node. And even though it has a default role assigned to it, it will use the role that you've assigned to the access key if you want to do that. The access key method is the only way really that I'm aware of. And I said likely here because someone in chat will probably show me how to do it differently. But if you're running Airflow on-prem, the only way that I know of is how to give a role to something that's on-prem in AWS is to have them have an access key, right? If you're using Astronomer Enterprise, there's even more options here. Basically, our Kubernetes platform lets you specify multiple different IAM roles that can be assigned to different Airflows inside your environment. So you might have an Astronomer Enterprise that has 3 different Airflows running, all on Kubernetes, all with their own pods. Well, you can map each one of those Airflows to a particular IAM role, and then you can keep your base IAM role that EC2 is on, for example, minimal, right? And it won't need all these cross-account permissions like we're talking about now. So this is something to look at. We actually have a doc on how to do this, and it's linked at the bottom. So.
And kind of doing it that way, what does that unlock for me? If I have my dev accounts, my dev instances, are they just pointing to my dev resources and then prod's pointing to the right sorts of the right prod infrastructure?
I'm sorry, what was that? I missed that.
Yeah. So like what would be the reason I'd want to give different Airflows, different IAM roles?
Yeah, 100%, like you said. And like in this example, imagine we had a dev AWS account and a prod AWS account. Back on this previous screen, when we said which roles I could assume, on the role that was for the dev Airflow, we would only give it the ability to assume the role for dev infrastructure, right? So if we were doing like a multi-account example like we're doing now, that's how you'd control access to make sure that airflow can only touch things in dev. If it tried to do anything in prod, it would fail, essentially. That's a common use case. And really, that maps to all those use cases I talked about before, the lifecycle, the security zones, chargeback, all that stuff. Like depending on which role you map to, you might want to make them multi-tenant for those reasons, essentially. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Okay. I've been talking a lot about leveraging connections here. And this is where, in order for that DAG to work, right? You notice in that DAG, I referenced a particular, AWS account 1, AWS account 2. In Airflow, we define those as connections before this DAG runs. And the only connection that you really need to put in here is which role do you want this to run as, right? And I'm actually going to show you that within Airflow real quick here. So here's my Airflow. This was the code I was looking at before. I'm going to go into connections. And you're going to see that I have those accounts set up as I talked about before. And if we go look at a particular configuration, one neat thing you'll see here is that one, it's defined as an AWS connection, but the only configuration here is what region do you want it to run in and what is the IAM role that you're going to use when you run this, right? This is a different role than what Airflow might be running on, right? This is the role you want it to run when it's leveraged and the DAG is calling this out. Also notice that the login and password is completely blank here, meaning we never configured a secret access key to get this to run. The only part that we configured was we gave it a name and we told it what role to run as. And that is the same for AWS account 2, same exact setup. The only difference is that it specifies a different role. And so then in your DAG, you just call out AWS 1, AWS 2 by these names, and then that's all it needs to run. Okay, let's get back here. Here's the actual code that I was specifying earlier, and here's where I'm calling out those names, right? AWS account 2, AWS account 1, and that's really the only thing you need to do in your DAG to specify which AWS account to use once you set that up in a connections field. And I talk about multiple accounts, but I think as AWS customers progress in their journey on AWS, the account proliferation is a very common thing where we see customers with not just 3 or 4, we see dozens of accounts essentially, right? And so being able to have those easily accessible programmatically in code like this can help you jump around. Now, there's one part here that's a little more nuanced, and that is the copy part. Copying data between buckets has additional privileges required beyond just the IAM roles. The reason for that is because S3 buckets themselves are governed by the permissions on the bucket and who has access to get data for that. There's a couple different ways you could go about this. The way I did it in this particular DAG is I did option 1, which is essentially using the Airflow account to perform this copy. In this case, I needed to grant the Airflow role read access from the source bucket. I need to grant it write access to the destination bucket. And then I perform the copy using the Airflow role itself. But now, since Airflow is really just orchestrating these things, you could do any of these 3. Instead, right, you could have Airflow run as the source account instead of itself. And then all you need to do is grant write access essentially to the destination bucket and read. Does that make sense? So 3 different options here. Basically, depending on what you want to do, they're all pretty similar. But in both cases, you'll get the end result of copying from one bucket to another. I will have a example of what that looks like in S3 configuration here. So to show that, here's an example of one of those bucket policies. And I'm basically going in and saying this particular role or user has the ability to do all actions. You could change this to a read, you could change this to just a write, whatever you need. But in my case, for simplicity, I said, this particular user has a chance to do these actions on this resource. So the S3 bucket configuration is a little more nuanced, like I mentioned, but that's essentially what you need to do. The other choice you have when copying data on Airflow in particular is which operator to use. And this one, I essentially used The Python operator with an S3 hook uses Batu under the hood, but there's a built-in S3 hook. It just has parameters that ask you to give a source bucket, source key, destination key, and it kind of does the copy for you. Another pattern I see is people using the bash operator and then using the AWS CLI. And at that point, you're more or less just copying in the syntax from one way or the other.
So we have 2 different operators, 3 different ways to set up the cross-account privileges. So 6 different ways to do something that's relatively, like, you think that's like a tried and tested 1 to 2, you know?
Yeah. No, I see a lot of times people, I think if you search in Google, like people trying to do things like this on Stack Overflow, most of the time their issues are related to permissions and not that their syntax is wrong. Like the Airflow syntax is pretty easy. In fact, I can show you that real quick. Let's go back to our DAG. Let's take a look at the code here. So in this case, really just 2 lines. Source key, destination key, source bucket, destination bucket. This is an S3 copy using the S3 hook, which is imported up here from AWS provider, right? Yeah, most people online get this part right. Most of the time, it's the bucket configuration pieces that are a little more nuanced. So
Python's the easy part.
Yeah, Python usually is, right? Okay. So this is where I was. We'll get back to presenting. Again, been doing all this with cross-account roles. And some people might say, Raj, perhaps based on your comment, like all this role permission stuff is confusing me. I'd rather just use secret access keys. My company has given them to me. Let me use them. In this case, this is very similar setup. The only difference is in the Airflow connection. Instead of specifying a role that you're going to consume, you're just going to put in the key itself, right? And so if you have 3 different AWS accounts, you have 3 pairs of keys, and then you're going to paste them into the login and password section there. And that's the only difference. When I do put a link in here as well from our website about putting your secrets in different backends. I mentioned earlier, like AWS Secret Manager, Vault, things like that. But these are definitely things that our customers are using when they go down this route. So
just adding on that a little bit, right? I think what we see a lot of times in production setups, like you were saying, Tony, is like actually a hybrid approach of the 2, where, you know, your permissions to your different resources will be governed by roles. But let's say you're hitting like an API with like a token or something along those lines, right? You'll want to do that in sort of the secrets backend.
Yep, that's great. That's a great point. Yep. All right, and I think that was my last slide. We could probably open it up to questions.
Awesome. Well, there's a couple questions here. I'll start them up to you, and then we can what's it called? We can just see where the conversation goes.
Okay.
So one is back to the topic of copying the files between S3 buckets. Why is it needed to copy S3 data instead of just cross-account, instead of just giving cross-account access like any of the other services? Like, go over why it's a little more complicated to do it with S3 when you're copying buckets between accounts.
Yep. No, that's a great question. And the answer is you don't need to. You can do exactly as they suggested. You could just give the other account access to that particular bucket. The reason I wanted to demonstrate copying is in the use case of data lifecycle promotion, oftentimes they will have different buckets and different accounts for that. So like, yeah, your data lives, you know, it could all live in the same place, but to get from raw data, for example, to protected, or from protected to shared, oftentimes they'll have different accounts or different buckets for that. And so I just wanted to show what it might look like to see data get promoted from one stage to another along that data lifecycle. From a pure functionality standpoint, you know, it's all in the cloud these days, right? It's all about gradient access, and it could just stay in one place. But I do see a lot of customers having this promotion process where it actually does copy data along the stage along the way. So.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it can be a lot as well, right? People have their application mirror the data that's being used around it, right? So maybe in dev, it's using your dev account for data that's powering an app versus in prod, you know, it's a little different. It's really interesting how we see like the application side of that and like the data side of that kind of coming together.
Yep, it's a great point.
So another question here from Vasanth is saying, can you go over again how to specify using different AWS connections for different tasks in the code?
Yeah, happy to. And I actually have the screen up. So I'm defining which account I'm going to use here. Now you notice these are just strings, right? But what they have to match is the connections that are set up in the connections place for Airflow. So I have these 3 AWS accounts here. If I look at them, the string in Python has to match this name here. This is the connection ID within Airflow. And then within your task, you can just go specify this particular name here. And this is the part that's gonna look for. If you do a typo at this point, Airflow will bark at you and say, hey, there's no connection by that name, right? Once you have those accounts defined in the code, I'll show you how I'm using these. So I'm just put these as constants at the top just to make them easy to reference and change if I need to. Then within the particular operators and the particular task, I just reference, here's my first task. I just say, hey, this is the parameter for the EMR create job. So the EMR create job flow operator takes a parameter called AWS connection ID, and then I specify that string I defined above, right? So that is essentially all we're doing to specify those accounts. And then for each particular task, I just call out which account that I specified up top. So Athena has account 2, EMR has account 1, and then the copy I mentioned earlier, all those different ways to copy data. I did this copy from the Airflow account, and then because it had the ability to both read from one bucket and write to another. So
it's all about that param there, the AWS con ID param. That's what it looks like for those EMR jobs.
Yep. One note, and maybe someone in the chat might be able to give advice on this, is that the EMR create job flow operator does ask for and require this EMR connection ID. Doesn't seem to have a lot of useful information. Like I created a connection in Airflow, but it doesn't really point to anything. It's just a default. And so this is telling Airflow to say, don't use any different connection for EMR, just use whatever the default is for AWS at the time. So, but that's very specific to the EMR job flow operator. One thing, and that actually brings up a good point. This session is very focused on permissions and using the built-in AWS IAM system to run different orchestration methods. You could do a completely network-based system with Airflow, right? Imagine you've already spun up EMR clusters in 3 different accounts and they have JBDC endpoints already. At that point, it's really just giving network connectivity to different places, but that's probably another talk for another time. And I would say it's not real cloudy either, right? Most of the time, in the cloud world, you're trying to not think of things that way and much more talk about permissions from an application level. And I think the IAM role fits a lot better in that pattern. So.
Another question from Evan. Can I programmatically add connections?
Is that?
I moved it to answers. I can take this one if it's okay.
Okay. Yeah, cool.
So, Airflow has a REST API that was experimental in the 1.10 release. As of 2.0, it's a full-featured, fully supported API. And there's an endpoint for adding, removing, and editing connections. Do that right as part of your CI processes, or however you like to set up your Airflow environments without having to do it manually. Another question from CJ. Does Airflow support storing the extra field configuration when opting to leverage AWS Secrets Manager backend to store the connection details? It's a good question. I actually don't believe it does today. I do know that some folks have asked around that. I know that there's different ways you can have that same functionality. I'm just not sure if you would do that in the extras field of a involved there. That's a great question, CJ. We'll definitely follow up with you on that one. I feel like a lot of users would want to do that.
Yep, interesting.
Question from Krishna. can we copy the data from different cloud providers to each other using Airflow, i.e. copy BigQuery data to Azure Synapse using Airflow?
Great question. So the answer, the copy is probably the more nuanced connection there, but you can have, I'm doing multi AWS account here, but we can add multiple cloud providers and have different connection types 100%, right? Now, the difference is that when you're within the AWS ecosystem, everything's going to be governed by IAM, right? And so if you're going to be leveraging going from one particular cloud provider like an AWS to Azure or to Google, there might be some different authentication mechanisms. Like Google's not going to want an IAM role, for example, to know it has permissions, but 100% there's going to be ways to configure up different connections. And yeah, this Raj might be, maybe we'll do the next orchestration is how do you run a single DAG across 3 different cloud providers, right? 100% doable. And, by the way the world's working, that'll be a commodity DAG in about a couple of months, right? So,
right. Yeah. And I think the other nice part about that, just following up on Christian's question, is it doesn't really matter how much data you're using, right? Whether it's 1 terabyte, 10 terabytes, 50 terabytes, whatever. The core concepts in Airflow are the same. There is some complexity as you use more and more data, like how does that manage? How is that stored? Is that pulled in locally at all? How are you going to stream that data from one spot to another? There's definitely some complexity there, but conceptually, all the parts work the same.
Yeah, and another point on that is you will find a lot of the DAGs when you look on Stack Overflow that talk about copying data in S3. If you're not careful, you will notice they will copy local, right? They're essentially doing a copy from S3, storing it in a data structure in Python, and then uploading it on the next step. And so the particular operator I'm using here is trying to do a particular S3 to S3 copy, but that's something to keep in mind is be looking as you maybe are copying examples from the internet, is this copying to my local Python first before uploading again, and try to find one that just does a straight copy. So,
question around Airflow best practice. We hear a lot that Airflow isn't recommended for data processing. Is that still valid? Or do you think that the way Airflow is used has been expanded?
Yeah, great question. And, I'm not a big fan of absolutes when it comes to IT infrastructure, right? It's whatever makes the use case work, right? Also, data processing can vary a lot depending on the size and scale and things like that. I think with things like custom backends and Airflow 2.0, the ability to get bigger and bigger from a data standpoint is growing from an Airflow standpoint. But and still today, like using it as an orchestrator, pushing the processing to the processing engines is still a best practice. But I think the guardrails are definitely loosening up, so to speak, on what Airflow can do as some of these features come out with 2.0 and custom backends and things like that. Raj, you probably been around Airflow as long as anyone. Do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head there, Tony. I think, in the past, it was definitely Bible not to do that. Now it's more of a guideline. We recently released a blog post using Airflow and a tool called Ray, and that made it so that it actually was good practice to do that data processing within Airflow. So I think a lot of it does depend on some of those things, like, hey, what are the tools at your disposal? What the use case is you're trying to accomplish? And you said it really well, right? Like absolutes nowadays don't really make a ton of sense, but just kind of really keep in mind what you're trying to do and all the factors around how you're trying to accomplish that. Another question around following the code after the session. Yep. So all the code that we went through, as well as the intro to the slides, will be sent out as part of the follow-up. So you can kind of run this in your own accounts, if you will. Looks like there is one last question from Ricardo. Is there a way to provide arguments when running a DAG other than CLI via --conf? That's a great question.
Is that conf for which command line utility? I'm trying to.
Yeah, so I think that there's a conf command line utility from the Airflow CLI. If you're not going to use that, right, you can supply runtime parameters when you go to trigger a DAG from the UI.
Got it. Yep.
And depending on how your configurations are, you could also have your configuration stored in variables and maybe just change those when you run there. So I think there's a few ways to skin that cat.
Okay. Yeah, my brain was in dash profile with the work for setting this up because I was using so many different AWS CLIs to set some of this up. So yeah, if it's anything like most CLIs, right, to your point, there should be a variable you could export that will make it so you don't have to type that in every time, right, and make it a little more dynamic. So
yeah, it's a good question though. I feel like another possible topic we do in the future is runtime parameters for DAGs and all the ways that you can edit those.
Cool.
Another question from Krishna asking for the next webinar topic is CI/CD with Airflow and how to deploy jobs with CI/CD and Airflow. I think that'd be a great topic, Tony. Yeah, maybe we can do that one as well. I think we have like 3 solid topic suggestions out of the questions today.
No, CI/CD with Airflow is one of my favorites, just because like it's in a lot of ways it's kind of the point, right, of Airflow and like how it came up for, and like having pipelines as code. Well, what's the benefit of having your pipeline as code? It's like, well, you can PR it, you can put it in these repository systems, version controls, promote it. Like that's a huge motivation for why companies are using Airflow today. So I love that topic, and I know a lot of our customers talk about it a lot, and it'd be great to do a webinar on that. So
yeah. Awesome. So it looks like there are no other questions here. We'll do a last call for questions. We'll give it a minute to see if anybody has any last minute things. Like I said, all of this will be packaged up and delivered to you in your inbox, sample code, as well as some of the slides Tony went through. That kind of shows you conceptually how all this is done. Question from the live stream. Are there any data binding solutions to use with Airflow? I'm not sure what data binding is off the top of my head. Tony, I'll kick that over to you.
Yeah, that's not a phrase that's I'm too familiar with, but yeah, have to look.
Yep. And then another question around the code sample for transient EMR. Was your example, Tony, using transient EMR?
Yep, it was. This EMR cluster doesn't exist until this task is run, and this task will spin up the job, run the job, and then cause it to stop when it's done. Yeah.
Perfect. Question around bootcamp that we're planning. Not planning a bootcamp right now, but if you want to kind of some more Airflow tutorials, please head over to academy.astronomer.io. Let me actually just drop a link to it in the chat here. And that's going to be where you can find our training materials in case you want to upskill yourself or other folks on your team. So it looks like we have one last question from Ken around sharing data between nodes. You want to take that, Tony? How do you share data between nodes with Airflow?
I mean, this is just referring to like between tasks and so forth, I'd imagine. I mean, XCOM particular, as we talked about before, if that's what he means. In this case, right, in this example, we're using S3 as kind of the back end for a lot of that. And we're not even reusing XCOM, we're letting the processing engines themselves work on the data, right? So Athena touches the data directly. It doesn't get it from a different task. It just expects it to be there in S3. And that's a pretty common pattern. But yeah, unless they were thinking of the question differently, Viraj, do you think, or?
No, I think you nailed the head there. I think using an external intermediary data store is probably pretty good practice. So it doesn't matter if it's different tasks touching the same data, or maybe you want the same data available to different physical nodes. If the storage layer is external, then anyone can pull from it really easily. Once again, to Tony's earlier point, not an absolute, but generally like a general guideline.
Yep. We do a little bit of that in this demo where we're actually getting the task instance of the particular EMR job so that this watch can know when the EMR cluster is up. And so this watcher knows like when it's done, basically. So that in this case, we're not doing any of the job data through XCOM, but we are using it to let the next task know which EMR cluster essentially to watch for to make sure it runs successfully. So.
Yeah, and I think like that method would work independently of infrastructure, right? So it doesn't matter if you're running on bare metal and containers and Kubernetes pods. You can just bake in a lot of that logic at the operator level, or even with the way your pipelines themselves are structured.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, looks like there are no more questions right now. So last thing I want to say is just the Airflow Summit. So we are doing the yearly Airflow Summit coming up in a couple of months here. If this topic was interesting to you and you're looking for more kind of hands-on talks about Airflow as well as workshops, please register. We're really looking forward to it. It's going to be a community event where we have Airflow users across all types of companies and use cases, kind of talking about how they're using Airflow within their organization. So look out for an email on that. Other than that, really do appreciate everyone taking time to come listen to us chat today. Thanks for the questions as well as the topics for further webinars. Maybe we'll find a way to weave them into our schedule there. That's all from me. Tony, anything from your side?
That's all. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks everyone. Talk to you all soon.
All right.